The next speaker is a very well-known person for me, since she's also from Umeå and a very good colleague of mine. And she's working with vegetation and e-flows and the ecosystem overall. So I'd like to present Birgitta Malm Renöfält from Umeå University.
Okay, can you hear me? Nobody complains, so I think you can. So yes, it's me again, and this time I'm presenting as myself. And I will talk about restoration of flood-maintained ecosystems and, well, not all flood-maintained ecosystems, because most organisms in rivers do like high flows, but I will focus on riparian and floodplain vegetation. And I will give a few tidbits from 3 different projects that we have: EcoPeak, FlowRip, and a collaboration project with Vattenfall. And I worked together with my colleague Roland Jansson on this too. So we mainly work with habitats in the Habitat Directive, and we do this in River Dalälven and in River Klarälven. And in Dalälven, we work with alluvial forest and mixed riparian forest, and also northern alluvial riparian meadows. And in Klarälven, we work with something a little bit similar to what we heard about yesterday, these point bar systems where you have a vegetation dynamics driven by sedimentation and erosion patterns. And we also have problems to maintain this älvsandjägare, strandsandjägare in Swedish, in these systems. And yeah. So what is similar between those systems is that they both Natura 2000 areas, and they have a severely diminished spring flood, so much lower spring flood than usual. So you can see before and after graphs here from both places. And just a little bit about what we do and how we work. In Klarälven, we work at 2 point bars. So Klarälven starts in Norway and then goes over to the Swedish side, and then there's a big dam, and then there is a free-flowing stretch with a little bit of fall height, but regulated flow, and then it sort of comes down on the flatland and it starts to meander. And this is quite unique for Sweden, for such a big river to have this. In Dalälven, we work in different areas. One in Bredforsen, which is a depleted reach, like what I talked about yesterday. It has a minimum flow of 15 cubic meters in summer and 5 cubic meters in wintertime, and the flow is very static. But we also work in the main stem of the river that has all flow in Färnebofjärden, which is famous for 2 things: being really, really species rich and having a lot of these flooding mosquitoes. So it sometimes can be a little of a nuisance to work there. And we work with, we place vegetation plots over the entire riparian zone, from the high summer water before regulation going down to the summer low water. And we place them with 20 centimeters apart, so we cover the whole riparian zone. And then we position them with a network RTK, so we get a very exact position. And then we have water level loggers and so on, and calculate the flow dynamics in each plot to be able to do this flow vegetation relationship inventories that we do. And this is an example from the alluvial meadows in Bredforsen. And the problem here is that we have an encroachment of Salixinera, gråvide, in those areas, so they're sort of being bushy, what would you say, bushification of them. They were traditionally these kind of meadows were traditionally used also for haymaking. They were really important for that. They're not anymore. They are, however, grazed. And on the right there, or left on your side, you can see a species list from the description of these kind of meadows. What are the typical and characteristic species that goes in there, and those in green are those that we found. And you can see the fat lines here. One shows this Salix cinerea, and one shows a very characteristic, typical species for those kind of areas, which is Calamidostis canescens or grenröd. And you can see they're almost similar in occurrence. You can also see that we have like two distinct areas here, one wetter alluvial meadow and one which is a much drier alluvial meadow. And in the drier part, there is quite, so on the y-axis, you have a density, relative density of species. And you can see that they are not as many of them as in the wetter part. So it's a quite distinct line there between them. And if we compare these areas to an unregulated river like Vindelälven, you can see in those graphs, the Vindel River are the red lines, and the Dalälven, the alluvial meadows, are the blue line. And the Vindel River, with its total species richness by location there, it behaves typically like what you expect to see. Intermediate disturbance hypothesis, school book example of the intermediate disturbed altitudes on the riparian zone also are the most species rich. And these are typically the graminoid zones and the Salix and Alnus zones where you find the most species. In the Dalälven, you can see that, well, the part in the lower part that actually gets water are more species rich, and then it gets more species poor. And these are smoothed curves, so that's why you get that little artifact thing in the end. It doesn't get more species rich there. And if we look at the woodiness, which is basically telling us how much Salix there is in different altitudes, you can see that in Vindel River, the Salix belt starts higher up, peaks higher up, and it's also not as dense as in the Dalälven, where it goes much further down. And if we look at the flooding times, flooding duration curves of the different places, you can see that they are quite different. Lower parts flooded a long time in Dalälven, upper parts not flooded at all. In the Vindel River, it's more smooth. So a higher and less static flow will promote meadow vegetation, and we will see a less disrupt difference between this drier and wetter meadows. We would have a much more even distribution of species. And also, lower part will have likely less encroachments of Salix cinerea. So we can model the extent of what we get, and we are working with Vattenfall together, who works with Nordkonsult, and they are modeling different flow levels. So we can calculate how much more we can get, and we can also give recommendations on the duration based on what we know how these different zones are distributed. However, Salix, somebody wants to see it gone altogether. It's a very natural genus in this kind of meadows. And encroachment is probably also an effect of the stopped haymaking. So it's also a other type of management issue. This is from the mixed riparian forest, and I'm just showing this to show that we work in the same way. We make these probability curves of where different species occurs. And the problem here is that we lose typical species, deciduous species like oak, for example, and encroachment on Norway spruce. This graph here is from Färnebofjärden, which is managed to take away spruce. So that's one problem when we want to look at this problem, that they are actually managing it very, very hard to take away spruce, because we want to see at what water levels and what duration can we actually keep spruce out. So there we have another project where we look at if we can design high flow pulses that will do the job of a natural spring flood, but it's shorter, therefore cheaper, and also less frequent, and therefore also cheaper, and less affecting the hydropower production. So what we do there is we work in 3 different levels, so to speak. We have a laboratory experiment where we inundate spruce in the lab, and this is something we've done this winter. So I'm going to show some results from that. We will do a transplantation experiment where we actually go out and plant out spruce, obviously not in the nature reserves, and obviously being careful to remove them when the experiment is over. So I will go out in 2 weeks and plant spruce, and then we will follow up this autumn and have it run whole next year as well to see. And then we will transplant them on different levels of the riparian zone and make relationship curves, flooding vegetation relationship curves. And we will also map and find areas where we do have, or it's not so heavily managed, and where we do have this problem with find little spruce plants and map where they are and where are the deciduous trees and so on, and make this curves over them. But that's for next summer. So the hypothesis is that we want to see if we can get away with 2 weeks every second year, if that is enough to exclude spruce seedlings. What is suggested is almost 1.5 months of flooding. So that's the idea behind that project. And here is a little bit of the results from the laboratory experiment. So we had 2 kinds of treatments, deep flooded and shallow flooded. And we also looked at survival of seedlings at different times. So we had intervals of 10 days, 22 days, 44 days, and then we had controls that were obviously not flooded to compare with. And we looked at survival and we looked at growth. So as you can see, with the deep treatment most of the seedlings died. But the shallow flooding was not enough to kill off those seedlings. And the survival, after 10 days, almost nothing had died. But after 22 days and also 44 days, most of the deep flood, so these are all, these are graphs that they should be split, but I got them from a master's student just before I went here, so we didn't have time to do that. But the dead here represent the deep flooded seedlings. And you can see also that it affects growth a lot. So the deep flooded ones, well, even the ones, these are the ones that are alive, they are not growing, practically not growing. A few of them are. But the shallow ones, they are growing. Oops, wrong way. So, well, we see that we started to kill off little spruce plants after 22 and 44 days. There is a possibility that we will actually be able to introduce floods that are shorter than the suggested ones to restore riparian forest. But this is a laboratory experiment. We will now go out in the field and do a field experiment on the same thing. So, yeah. This might be even more effective in the field because we had good condition in terms of, even though we did actually have another treatment, and that was standing water and oxygenated water where we had the airflow through it. It didn't show anything because I think the standing water didn't really become standing. It was still oxygenated. So that's something that we might also see in the field, the difference from. And now we move south down to Klarälven. And here we are working with these point bar habitats, where we explore erosion and sedimentation sites. We look at species richness and composition. We looked at regulation effects on these different vegetation belt extent, and looking at relationships between flow and sedimentation and erosion. There you can see the typical point bar sandy areas. When we compare the two, the sedimentation side of the point bar and the erosion side of the point bar, we see that, well, the erosion plots are more or less a subset of what's in the sedimentation plots, but the sedimentation plots have some unique species, especially those belonging to the Salnik-Alnus zone and the Graminoid zone. And if you remember, these are the most naturally the most species-rich zones in the riparian vegetation. And these are just the two sites looking similar results. And when we look at the extension of those belts before and after regulation, you can see that the flow duration curves looks quite different before, obviously, before regulation. So either now, after regulation, either we have plots that are flooded a long time or not flooded at all. And this has an effect. So you can see that the Graminoid and the Salnik zones are very much diminished after regulation. So the orange ones are after and the blue ones are before comparisons. And so if we want to promote those zones, we can calculate, okay, what is the distribution of them now? What was the distribution of them before? And what flows does that equal? Well, we've done that for these two sites, found a flow level, and yeah, a duration is always difficult. Should we go what we know from the Vindel River? We have the durations there. Maybe that's the first suggestion you would give. Could we get away with a little bit shorter flooding? Do we need to do it every year, or do we do it? Can we get away with doing it every second year, every third, fourth year, so on? So if you take this and actually make measures out of it, I think you have to be a little bit adaptive, because we're trying to get around this, how we always get, okay, that's a flood level, but how long should they be? Well, if we base on what we know from nature, from unregulated rivers, they should be this long, but how often and so on. So, yeah, as we heard yesterday, the lack of these high flows is a problem, because we disrupt this sedimentation and erosion patterns, and we don't get enough sediment. So there is a big dam on the Swedish side, just when you pass the border. But then you have a free-flowing reach, and you have tributaries and so on. So there is internal sediment dynamics going on in that reach. And when we were out, it was the year 2018, and we actually placed the loggers out in December, water level loggers, because we want long series of water level data. So we placed them out in December 2017, and we thought that, oh, we placed them far out. Not going to be a problem, because you don't want them to end up on land, obviously. You want them to measure the water level. Not going to be a problem. And then the spring flood came 2018, and it was big. We had big floodings. But then, as you remember, 2018 was a super dry year. So this is when we came out in the summer, in August, to do inventories. I was like, where's the river? Gone, it's far out there. no water level logger, but we had this RTK coordinates data on it. And we started digging at that spot, and the logger was actually covered in more than 60 centimeters of sediment. So, and we know that the spring flood, the level of the spring flood that year wasn't that extreme if we compared to previous years. We do get these floods from time to time. So maybe we should also look at the erosion side of it. Rather than the sedimentation. What if the sandbars disappear faster than they build up? And we see that we have a higher water levels in winter. We also have effects from hydro peaking on this. So with the potential ice erosion with higher water levels compared to pre-regulation and the hydro peaking effects, we should also look in more to the erosion side of the part. Yeah, that's all I had.